I'm ahead of the curve, and in this video I will be reviewing I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, published in 2004, and the authors of this one are Norman Geisler and Frank Turek. Now, as regular viewers, and also those who own a pair of eyes, given the Hitchens t-shirt, I am an agnostic atheist, which would mean that I'm open-minded about these sort of ideas revolving around religion and spirituality, but I lack a belief in it entirely at the moment. But yeah, I'm open to the idea, essentially. I'm more of in a investigatory phase or procedure. So my reasons of reading this book is out of mere interest and my genuine wonder for what is true about reality. And so, yeah, I'm not reading this to sort of, I don't know, carelessly denigrate it or to dismiss its ideas. I read this book trying to be on the side of the authors, which are theologian believers. Going into this book, I knew one of the authors from YouTube, Frank Turek. I've seen his debate with Cosmic Skeptic, Christopher Hitchens, so I'm fairly familiar with him. And so, yeah, I wanted to see what he'd say in text form, and the other author I've never really heard of before. But yeah, I guess we should just get straight into this. So yeah, I just wanted to put that disclaimer down of me not trying to dismiss the arguments. I'm not going into this carelessly. I want to take these ideas seriously, because I don't read for any other reason. I'm not reviewing this to make fun of it. That is the opposite. I do genuinely care about the arguments, and I'm responding to them as truthfully to myself as I can. Even if I'll be negative or positive, you know, it doesn't mean that I'm affirming a particular belief. It's more of the style that is put forward. To be honest, I did quite enjoy the first few chapters. I felt that the dialogue on philosophy was quite interesting in particular. And this was because the title of this was, What is Truth? And anyone who watches the podcast or just knows me in general knows that I love that question, and I love speaking about that, and I love thinking about it. And something that I'm not really to terms with yet, but it got me thinking about it, is what my standard of evidence is. Because what I realised, and I'll discuss this more, what I realised throughout the book is that different types of evidence demand different types of, how do I put this? Believability, I suppose. For example, historical evidence is by no means as reliable as empirical evidence, because empirical you can consistently prove to be true, whereas historical evidence, firstly, the premise is compromised by it being historical by nature, and so you can't consistently verify that like you can with empiricism. And so what this chapter made me think about is what my personal standard of evidence is for my particular beliefs across a broad spectrum. So for some things, I take the historical documents and eyewitness testimonies as, you know, a truth, I suppose, like the Holocaust. But like we've seen, if we are thinking about the history of Nazi Germany here and the concentration camps, the Nazis tried to extinguish all evidence of the camps ever being there. And whilst they did a pretty good job of it, we can still materially indicate that the Holocaust happened, in a court of law, I mean. But intuitively, we all know that the Holocaust happened. It's just when we bring it to court and when we think of the material evidence instead of the intuition or the eyewitness testimony evidence, then we come to realize that actually the Nazis did this because it means that it's harder to prove consistently, I suppose, like materially. And this got me thinking of the resurrection as well. Now, I'm going to talk more about this, but the resurrection is a historical event. And it got me thinking of, well, if I take the Holocaust for granted as being true from the eyewitness testimonies, from it intuitively being true, you know, if I take that for granted easily, then why am I having a double standard on, let's say, the resurrection? Obviously, the resurrection, however, is a transcendent claim, whereas the Holocaust isn't. It's grounded in reality. And I think this distinction should be made. theologians act as if the resurrection is just a historical event, and that's how they prove it to happen. But really, it's more than that, because to prove the resurrection of Jesus to be true, that is beyond any historical claim. That is something that is extraordinary, therefore beyond a historical argument. And so I think that you could say that there's a double standard there, but then I'd retract that and I'd say, well, okay, well, everything leading up to the resurrection, which isn't transcendent in nature, fair enough, you can hold that comparison. But when it comes to the actual resurrection of a human being, i.e. Jesus, when it comes to that, I don't think historical evidence is eligible to prove that to be true. I think it should be taken into account, of course, like all evidence should, but at the same time, historical evidence alone can't prove that to be true, as far as I'm concerned. My standard of evidence lies when the claim meets the nature of the evidence. Therefore, a resurrection being an extraordinary event, a miracle, should be met by extraordinary evidence. So where I felt that I was let down by the book was as soon as philosophy and theology was thrown out the window for cosmology and understanding science. Because wow, Frank Turek and Geisler, they misrepresent science entirely. They misrepresent cosmology. It's quite clear that they only stick to their fields. I mean, I'm sure that they understand philosophy because I found the first chapter to be interesting and I felt that they took that seriously. But when it came to the other topics, they were just out of their league. I mean, they could have at least done the research to make sure that the things that they were saying were verifiably true, but they weren't. I mean, for example, Turek was like, you can't prove the scientific method with the scientific method. But that's a contradiction in terms, or not even a contradiction, but a semantic misnomer. And this is because the scientific method is only testing what is consistently true. And so it doesn't necessarily equate that the scientific method should be shown to be consistently true as itself, because it depends on the other variable, right? So the variable itself is what has to be consistently proven to be true, but the method itself is intuitively obvious given that we live in this reality, and with this tool we get consistently true results. So that proves that the methodology is consistent. So in a way, from this process, you can prove that this method is consistent. But I mean to say that it is a misunderstanding, if anything, to claim that the scientific method is useless because on its own it carries no weight. It's like saying mathematics is arbitrary just because an x on its own without any context carries no actual weight. I mean, that isn't how we should think about it. It's more of the relationship between the material tool and the theory that goes after that. Also, they seem to misunderstand what the Big Bang actually is. They claim that the Big Bang was the beginning of time, but actually that isn't how it's defined at all. A simple Google search just comes up with the fact that it's the earliest known time of the universe. It isn't the beginning. And this is where, again, the authors misunderstand what they're talking about. And it's like they didn't even Google, they didn't even proofread what they were talking about. It was utterly shocking. I thoroughly enjoyed the first few chapters on philosophy, what is true. But again, like when they go into these topics, I'm like, have you actually Googled this? Do you really know what you're talking about? And the answer to that is obviously no in this case. They also say that microevolution is to be doubted and so forth, which there is more mystery over microevolution, sure, but that doesn't mean we should throw it out entirely. This is what I mean. Any gap in our knowledge, scientific knowledge, is then, by their standard, God. The God of the gaps. Like any sort of ignorance that science has, God must be the answer. And the problem is, as well, is that this has been done historically countless times. You know, we didn't understand why rain occurred on a certain day, and we'd attribute it to Zeus being angry. It's absolutely medieval. And the fact that they're taking this seriously in the modern sense is, well, it's worrying, if anything. So from this gap of knowledge, the authors then assume that because we don't know, and something can't come from nothing, which is a fair statement, but again, it's not true in terms of a consistent conclusion, it's just an intuition. They're therefore inserting this deity into the question when it's just as unfalsifiable as the infinite universe theory in itself. So really, the scientist is just being honest and saying, well, we don't really know, and the theologian is just placing that cement mixture in the hole and saying, well, we don't know, so it must be a deity, it must be a cause. And that is the mistake that these sorts of theists make all the time. So it's very juvenile of a mistake as far as I'm concerned. And what especially rubbed me the wrong way about their misunderstanding of the scientific enterprise was the claim that because scientists are human, the scientific method itself is invalid. And I think this is just a testament to the fact that they have never written a scientific paper, because how a paper gets verified is by thousands of different scientists, by looking at it repeatedly and again repeating the experiments and seeing whether the theory consistently is reliable upon the practice. And so just because a scientist has a bias doesn't mean that the result is invalid. It might mean that the discussion of the results is perhaps misleading, but that's exactly why these studies have many different people acting them out in a different way. And so, yes, I agree, in one paper that might be true, but to get it peer-reviewed and to be a verifiable scientific theory, it has to be repeated hundreds of times. And so, again, this is further evidence that they have probably never even read a scientific paper, let alone even looked into it online before writing this book. It's a shame that they are so unreliable in their writing, and it's also misleading to anyone who doesn't know the science as well. Like, a theist would read this and they think, oh yeah, applaud, but it's just a mischaracterization of the entire process, and this breeds ignorance, which is the main problem in this scenario, and that's what they've elaborated as well from actually getting to publish this book, which, to be honest, is a miracle in itself, pardon the pun. So moving back to my thoughts on the resurrection of Jesus, I did notice that the standard of evidence of the theist versus the atheist must be lower on the theist side, because really, to accept the resurrection and the Gospels, you have to rely on the historical evidence, which, as I mentioned before, is inherently unreliable. The thing is as well, I don't doubt that a lot of the Bible is historically accurate. Of course, I'll grant that all day. I'm not going to write off the entire book. But what I will say is that the most exceptional claims should not be put on the same pedestal as those that are normative claims. Of course, there are a lot of cross-examinations that can be offered of the Bible and its historicity, and of course that can be done, and of course you can see correlations between witness accounts. But the thing is, when it comes to what Matthew wore on the day of writing his gospel, compared to the actual resurrection of Jesus, I think they might have the same level of authority on paper, but when you actually think about it seriously, I would expect the resurrection itself to have more of a stable and consistent basis of proving that to be true. And this is the thing as well, is that even if the historical evidence was watertight, I still would have doubt with it, because again, it's using historical evidence, which is not extraordinary, to prove something that is extraordinary, and that's my issue. I think the evidence inherently is not compatible with logically believing in that occurring in the first place. But the standard of evidence has to be lowered on the Christian side, because the only axiom of that evidence is historical, therefore subjective, and therefore not consistently provable to be true. And that's my issue. It's the empirical side, in comparison, is far superior. And really, I'd expect the empirical measurement to be one of a deity to use if they were trying to convince the population or its people, surely that would be a much more considerable line of reasoning that would be encouraged in the humans, instead of just using, eyewitness testimonies, which are not even reliable in the first place as well. Especially people of 2,000 years ago. Groupthink does exist, and this isn't the equivocation of the hallucination theory. This is more to say, and this exists even in the modern age, is to say that if you want something to be true, then it's more likely that you're going to experience an illusion, or let's say a true thought of that thing being legitimate. And it's very true that many of the followers of the resurrection wasn't in their favor to lie or anything like that, and I agree. However, just because somebody dies for their beliefs doesn't mean that that belief is inherently true. It just means that their conviction is extremely high. And at the end of the book as well, there was a dialogue between the theist and the atheist, and I just found this to be a complete straw man, because the atheist was so, predictably so. It was so sort of juvenile, the arguments that they were presenting, and the theist was offering, watertight responses, and the atheist at the end was like, oh my god, that must be true, and you've disproven me and everything. It's like, why would you even have that as a segment in your book? Like, what does that even prove? Because to me, it's just an obvious, and even if it is a good representation, it's still disingenuous, because the authors really can't just make up the side of the atheist. They can guess what the atheist would say, but as a theist. And the thing is, even if you understand the atheist's arguments, it's still disingenuous. That's the thing. I think that the segment was utterly misplaced, and the conversation, this made-up conversation, was just sort of hammered the nail in, that this book, whilst interesting and, entertaining at times, it was very unreliable in terms of solid information and, reliability on what is true, I suppose. Although I did do a lot of annotations throughout, usually just complaining about the sloppiness of the research. But to be honest, I did like the historical chapters and as I said, the philosophical, the historical resurrection chapters. There was a few sections on that. And I liked how seriously they were taking some chapters, like the resurrection or the historicity of the Bible. I enjoyed that because it felt like a genuine attempt. But when it comes to the cosmology and criticizing the scientific method, it's completely misled, and it's a true misunderstanding of the entire enterprise of science. And what this book did really tell me, again, is that the standard of evidence is much lower for the theist. There's so many assertions and assumptions that are really not legislated or justified, because it's most of the time just creating a big straw man of what the beliefs of the non-believer actually thinks. There was also some interesting dialogue on the Quran, and I have reviewed the Quran if you want to go check that out. A few months ago I reviewed that, and the comment section is a load of fun, so enjoy that one. But when they were mentioning the Quran, I couldn't help but agree with them, just because of how, let's just think of the Quran when it says that Jesus' body was swapped for a fake. The Quran was written like 600 years after the event, and the Quran is really relying on its own premise to be true for the people reading it to believe in it, because even if you don't believe in the Bible, at least you can grant that some of the historical things in the book or books was, in some sense, or it did happen. Whereas in the Quran, there's no real historical evidence there. In terms of this particular example of the resurrection, the Quran just relies on you to be like, oh, yep, that must be true because Allah said so. It's extremely, the Quran itself was just a regurgitation of the Bible, as I said in my video on the Quran. But I don't agree with either books, spiritually speaking, but I think the Quran is an obvious replicates of it, and I think that it's much less impressive than the Bible as well. But I won't tell you all about the Quran because you can just watch the video on it. But anyway, yeah, I liked the criticism of the Quran because, well, you know, looking from the outside in, it's quite funny seeing a Christian and a Muslim debate because, you know, as the atheist, you're just like pretty neutral. You're just like, well, fair enough, I'll just watch this happen. Yeah, so I enjoyed that, although I don't know how. Well, obviously the Christian would be biased in this regard, but, you know, I think it was a good point anyway, criticising the historicity of the Quran and its lack of historical evidence on the claim that Jesus' body was replaced. Yeah, so that's fair enough on the author's side. I'd agree with the nonsensical claim that the Quran makes there. And many more things were discussed in the book, like morality, although I have talked about morality quite a lot in other videos. So I'd recommend you maybe watching my C.S. Lewis Mere Christianity review or my Quran review again, or even watching the podcast. There's an episode on what is truth, and I talk about religion quite a bit as well, and you know, morality in regard to truth, I mean. And so, yeah, I don't know what else to go into from the book, because it is, you know, there is quite a lot of it, and I wouldn't want you to assume that I was picking and choosing, because but I think for me the most interesting parts were the parts that I mentioned, the resurrection, the historicity of the Bible, and the philosophy in it as well. What can be determined as being true, etc., etc. I felt that when recounting the validity of the Bible and that sort of thing, I felt that they were being quite honest in that regard, even if they might have been misled by their understanding of it. I felt that their approach was honest, at least. But when it came to the universe, the scientific method, you know, the atheist's perspective in general, I felt that it was very disingenuous, and if not disingenuous, then just very ignorant, really. But overall, I did enjoy reading the book because, you know, it's always better to know better to know your enemy, I suppose. But yeah, it's one that I'll probably go back to as well, because there are quite a lot of arguments in here. I imagine that a lot of people searching this book review up, you know, apart from my lovely subscribers, I'm sure that a lot of them will perhaps watch this video and they'll adamantly disagree with what I said. However, if you are watching this as a theist, please comment what I have got wrong, perhaps, and especially on the resurrection point, on the standard of evidence, and maybe the morality as well. I would like to know your thoughts on the piece, because, I don't know, I'm probably the only, well, I don't know, maybe the only atheist who's reviewed this on YouTube. I'm not sure. Yeah, so comment your reply to some of what I've said. If you disagree with it, well, if you did agree with all of it, then I'm glad I converted you, but I doubt it. So, yeah, I'm going to end it there. I've been ahead of the curve, and I'll see you, hopefully, in the next video.
Show me the evidence. Show me the evidence. Right.